Hello, 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 and as always, welcome to Inner Work for Greater Good. My name is Emily Eldridge. I am your host. I am the founder of Change Light, the creator of the Change Light system, which heals your inner struggles, reveals your inner strengths, and accelerates your power to feel good and do good, ultimately to change the world in whatever ways you feel called to do. I was thinking actually before, right as I was about to start, I was like, it's inner work for greater good, but my brain switched it and said greater work for inner good. And that is true. That is true too. That we really are talking about doing this incredible inner work so that you can feel greater, or so you can feel inner good, doing greater work on yourself so you can feel this inner good. Because as I've always believed, and other people have said it more succinctly than I have, that when you feel good, you do good. So that's what this is really about, is accelerating your ability to make a difference, whatever difference you feel called to make, but from a place of feeling good and feeling whole and at peace with yourself, because that's when you're really going to show up the best, the fullest, the brightest, the most impactful in your life, in other people's lives too, and in every aspect of your life for the world. So today we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to, a lot of times I've sort of talked about kind of issues that we may run into in our lives or things I've been thinking about. Well, one thing that came to mind is I want to talk about the inner child, but I want to talk about certain aspects of the inner child. Now, I think I've said this before in a previous episode. To talk about the inner child as though it's one thing is actually incorrect. And I understand why it sort of evolves that people talk about the inner child as opposed to the plural, which is correct, that we have multiple inner children inside of us. I understand that talking about the inner child is helpful, at least in terms of our consciousness, to recognize that we have this, we have a child part inside of us, and that we have this child's voice or this child's innocence, and also to talk about the wounds of the inner child that we all carry. Well, the truth of the matter is that actually we have multiple inner children, and I'm pretty sure I've said this before, that it's not just one inner child we're talking about. We actually have multiple. I personally have drawn out probably hundreds of inner children, and my clients have drawn out multiple inner children, and it's not the same inner child. We always check that. It's like, is this the same one as before? No, it's not, is what my client will tell me, and I can feel that too. There's a difference between if I'm drawing out this one child and I'm processing its feelings and I'm healing its wounds or whatever's going on there, versus like another inner child that I might work on later on, and I realize, no, this is different. This is a different part of me. This was a different wound that it's carrying. This was a different moment in time from whence it was carrying that wound. So we have more than one inner child. So I just want to make that very clear. But that being said, I'm calling this episode, I think, the inner child, the confusion pain of the inner child. But it's really about inner children, because, and let me explain about this aspect. And the reason why I'm doing a whole episode on this is because I think this is something that is sorely missing from a lot of conversations about the inner child, understandably so. A lot of times when we talk about the inner child or inner children, we talk about the wounds of the inner child. We talk about, the inner child being scared, or maybe it's throwing a temper tantrum, or, maybe it's really sad, or maybe it's more like it's joyful and it's happy and it's in a good place. And so we can have different childlike, I guess, aspects of us that show up in different ways, or that have different energies or emotions to them. And a lot of times, if, like, for example, when I'm working with someone's an inner child, let's say, which shows up in a drawing out process session, which if it's hurt in some way, or in some kind of pain, or in some kind of fear, I call that an inner wounded. So if I'm working with that inner wounded, so oftentimes that childlike part that's carrying that wound or that hurt or that pain or whatever, usually it can be because of a violation, because, they were actually physically hurt, because, their homes were not safe, because of something a teacher said to them. And usually that inner child can say, like, that really hurt my feelings, or be carrying that intense violation. Maybe the person was sexually abused, or in some way physically violated. And so that inner child, that child inside of them, is carrying the pain of that abuse. But there's another kind of pain that I want to acknowledge here that I think is really, really, know is really, really important. And I've had this pain inside of me, and my clients have had this pain inside of them. And I want to acknowledge it as a pain, because it is a kind of pain that people experience, and that is experienced by a child, or, you know, one of these inner children, or experienced by children really when they have these types of experiences, that it's a kind of pain. And I'm calling it the pain of confusion. Here's how it typically shows up. I'll tell you actually the first time that it showed up for me. It was just in the last few years actually that I was really aware of it being that the specific pain I was experiencing was confusion. It wasn't so much sadness or hurt. It was more just confusion. Like, I don't understand. I was processing and healing some wounds from childhood that had been triggered by a current, this was a few years ago, but had been triggered by a situation in my life at the time. And what was coming up was the realization that there were, these wounds from childhood that were being triggered by this situation, and that I needed to heal those wounds in order for me to be not as triggered or affected by what was going on. And what came up was this little girl. I drew out this little girl, inner little girl of mine. And she was just simply saying, I don't understand. I don't understand. I mean, it was like she just kept, I don't understand. She just kept saying, like, I don't understand. And I think when I drew her, I haven't tried to find the drawing, but I think when I drew her, I probably even put like question marks around her head. I don't understand. Why? And what it was, why are they treating me this way? Why are they treating me this way? I didn't hurt them. Why are they hurting me? And really the primary pain, again, was not like the pain of the hurt that they were causing. It was the pain of the confusion. I don't understand. And so it was such an interesting moment for me personally, because to realize that just the confusion alone was a source of wounding and pain and inner conflict and struggle that I'd been carrying, and that a lot of us do carry. And I'm going to break this down for you. Actually, it's funny because as I'm talking about this, I realized that I also ran into a similar inner child inside of an inmate a number of years ago. And in that, he had been shamed around his sexuality. And there was a lot of hypocrisy with his parents, because they were very strict religious people who, absolutely said can't talk about sex or sexuality or any of these things. And yet he found his own father actually reading a porn magazine. And so it created this huge confusion inside of him. I'm like remembering this. This was a number of years ago. I was working with this man who was an inmate, and he was actually in prison for having, I believe, I don't know for sure because they don't usually tell me exactly what they did, and they don't actually even tell each other a lot of times, but I think he had probably sexually violated some children, or at least one child. So the point is that he drew this child inside this box with question marks. He was so confused because here his parents had said, don't ever do this. This is shameful. This is terrible. This is awful. And yet he caught his own father doing that same thing. So this sweet, innocent kid inside, kid that he was, can carry that confusion, the pain of that confusion all those years. And so for me, it had to do with, I don't understand why they're treating me this way. And that was the conflict, the inner conflict. That was the struggle. That was the source of pain for me. And I want to bring this up because you might have this as well, whether you're aware of it right now or not, but that part of what creates an inner struggle inside of us or perpetuates it is that confusion. And I've broken it down into like 3 types of confusion, if you will. And I will say that, and this is like patterns that I've seen within inner children with whom I've worked. So the first, as I've mentioned here in my experience and in the experience with the inmate, is familial. So I'm sort of breaking it down in terms of here's sort of the people closest to you and then kind of going outwards. So familial, the confusion of, for example, one of the most common is when a parent violates in some way or another that child. When a parent, so it can be a horrible kind of violation, like a sexual violation, a physical violation, a violation of boundaries. But basically, when a parent behaves in a way that is non-parent-like, and what I mean by that is, and this is what I'm sort of, what I kind of theorize, or sort of my hypothesis about this, is that as children, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, children instinctively know, we instinctively know how a parent should treat us. So if you've got a parent, whether it's a father figure or mother figure, there's this instinctive expectation of a child that I think we just all have, that it's like a mother should be nurturing, a father should be caring, parents should be protective. They should look after the child. That's their job. So that's just one example, like protectiveness and caring, nurturing, that is like, this is, again, my own hypothesis about it, but it's like, that's an instinctive knowing that a child has, or most children have. So when a parent violates that, so for example, and this happens a lot, is when you have, let's say, one parent who was somehow abusive towards the children or the child, and the other parent didn't protect them, but allowed it to happen, or looked the other way, or whatever the case was, is there can be this massive confusion, there often is, this huge, horribly painful confusion inside that child, that forms inside that child, and then often sticks there until it, stays there through into adulthood, of, well, but why didn't, let's say the father was abusive, but why didn't mommy protect me? I don't understand. Or, mommy was yelling at me, but daddy didn't do anything. Why didn't daddy protect me? And so there's this confusion. The way I see it is there's this real like dissonance and this awareness of that disconnect within the feeling of disconnect within the child between, but this is what a parent is supposed to do. This is what they're supposed to be. This is how they're supposed to treat me or take care of me. But they're not. They're doing this other thing. So what can end up happening is sometimes you'll have a child who, or someone who grows up as an adult into, I don't trust adults or I don't trust parents. But you can also even so, and this may actually be at the core, again, I haven't really studied this, but this may be at the core of a lot of times what we run into with adults, children who basically like, they have this still trying to redeem the parent or still protecting that abusive parent. And again, I would have to like do sort of more of a study on this to really be conclusive. But my guess is that a lot of times that results from that confused inner child who just can't seem to rectify and rectify, or whatever the word is, make sense of the fact that this is what my parent is supposed to do, but this is actually what they did do or didn't do. And so here, or here's what a parent is not supposed to do, but here's what they actually did. There's that dissonance. And so what you end up with is that inner confusion. So I'm talking mostly about familial. And another example would be, I have another client, a lot of clients like this, but another client who the father was physically abusive to my client. But it would come at very unexpected times. And, she'd be coming home from something and she'd be feeling really, really wonderful. And all of a sudden the father would rage at her and attack her and beat her. And she had this confusion about, but what did I, and she drew this out not too long ago. I don't understand what I did wrong. Like, why did he do that to me? What did I do wrong? And so that what had lasted beyond that moment of having been physically and verbally attacked was really the pain of that confusion, that it just didn't make sense to her as a child. Because if you think about it too, we also instinctively, I think most of us have a sense of justice and injustice. And so a child can probably go, well, yeah, I did something wrong. So I understand I got there were consequences for that. I think most children could rectify that. They could make sense of that and go, okay, I did something wrong. And so, that's why I'm not getting, the lollipop as promised, whatever. But when there's a lack of sense making and there's a lack of there being like a, well, this, and then therefore this, that creates that pain of that confusion. And especially when it comes at the hands of a parent, that can be really, really, of course, distressing and unsafe making, so that the child feels unsafe. So those are examples, just a few examples of familial confusion pain, if you will, of an inner child. There's beyond that what I would call like the communal or the societal. And so that often happens when a child grows up in an environment where, because of the sort of norms or strictures or rules or injustices or whatever's going on within that community or that society, that person, that child suffered those wounds or that treatment that was so deeply confusing. Like, why are they treating me that way? What did I do wrong? I don't understand. Again, those question marks around the head. And a lot of times, and I've run into this with my clients, with some of my clients, a lot of it has to do with things like racism. So I've had a number of clients where we've drawn out the wounds of racism inside of them when they were treated differently simply because of the color of their skin. So an example was when a client's teacher treated him differently and singled him out because of the color of his skin, made him feel unsafe in that environment, made him feel shamed, made him feel treated differently and treated worse than. And so that's an example of more of a communal or societal thing. There's another one that can be in terms of men and women. When we're treated differently as women, and we can see it. And again, if you're a child, you may not be consciously aware of it as a child, or you may be, but the point is there's still that awareness when, the child knows. And as adults, as we grow into adulthood, we can form all kinds of protective mechanisms, and even like cognitively, I guess, protective mechanisms to protect us from the reality of what we're experiencing, just so that we can get along and not get too enraged and risk, risk breaking the bonds that we've made. I mean, there are all kinds of psychological reasons why we try to internally normalize the crap that we're seeing and experiencing. There are people who could probably talk a lot better about that than I. But I'm sure you've experienced this too, where you realize that you allowed yourself to be gaslit, and you allowed yourself to put up with certain behaviors or mistreatments or unequal treatment because of, maybe because you're a woman. That's a big one, right, for us women in this network. But also for skin color, for class. If you were born into a certain class, if you will, classism is a big form of discrimination as well. And so if you as a child experienced that classism, maybe you were from a lesser class, you were born into poverty, or maybe you were middle class, if you will, but you spent a lot of time around wealthy people, whatever, and you may have experienced some of that classism. That can also create that dissonant, confusion pain inside you. It probably may have created that when you were a child, that injustice, that sense of, why am I being treated differently? It's not something that's my fault. That confusion. And again, I think that comes from the instinctive knowing of a child that, well, we're all the same, right? Or we should all be treated equally. I mean, you look at kids on the playground for the most part, and, up until certain ages is my understanding, most kids they don't see color differences in skin color. They don't necessarily care whether one kid is rich or not. They're just kids, little kids. You really don't start to notice that. From my understanding, I'm not an expert on children, but they don't start to notice that until they get older. And so, but the reality is society, the community can project and impose its stuff onto those kids. And the kids can notice that and then have this confusion around, but why does this happen? I don't understand. So that's another one, what I would call that communal, that societal, being treated differently, experiencing that pain, or even seeing, a friend treated differently. because of that. What's coming to mind is another example, and that is that someone very close to me who is a very dark-skinned Black woman, and in her 80s, she experienced racism firsthand when she was a little kid. I mean, she's experienced it a lot throughout her life, but even from when she was a little kid. And it was found out that she and her Black siblings were playing with these white neighbor kids, and they all had a great time. They were such good friends. They would hang out together. They would skip stones. They had a wonderful time. But the people in the town that they were in Texas, found out that these Black and white kids were mixing, that they were playing together. Now, they didn't see the difference. Why would they see the difference? But the point is that society imposed its racist and exclusionary, prejudicial, whatever words you want to use, onto these innocent children who were just enjoying themselves together and not even thinking about any of that stuff, because they just liked being together. That's all that mattered to them. And when I talked to this woman, my Black friend in her 80s, she teared up. I mean, from all of those decades. She was only like 6 or something when this happened. Oh, I should explain that actually they found out they weren't allowed to play with those kids anymore. I don't think they ever really spent time with them ever again. Maybe they just saw them from a distance. But the point is, they were separated. And even in her 80s, she was carrying this deep sadness about that. But also this confusion too. Like she said, it just didn't make sense. We didn't understand. So that was some real pain that stayed with her for decades, and is still probably with her for decades and decades and decades, from that time when she was separated from her dear friends for reasons that had nothing to do with them, and entirely because of the injustices of the society in which these sweet kids were living at the time. That's a confusion pain right there that she's carrying. And I would also argue that I wouldn't be surprised if the white kids were carrying that as well. The ones who were playing with the Black kids, they were like, I don't understand. Why can't I play with my friends? They're my friends. So it can happen on both sides. It can happen in both the children who are being discriminated against and the other children who are having to suffer also the consequences of that discrimination. So there you go. Finally, I would say there's an even bigger one, right? So we have the familial, which is really what's close to home. When someone from the family, when there's some kind of violation or something, there's that confusion that comes up from having seen or experienced something that's just so contrary to like the innocence of that child. And then the communal and societal, which, has more to do with sort of the surrounding community or the specific society in which that child grows up and what they witness and what they experience themselves. That kind of confusion of, I don't get this. To, I would say, to the bigger one of humanity. And here's the example I'm going to use for this one. Now, this didn't have to do with my own inner child, because the experience didn't happen to me as a child. And so it wasn't like I was carrying a child that was wounded from that experience. But for me, I realized just a few years ago, 2018, I had it. So I was in 9/11. I was a first responder. I was there for the first 2 weeks. I was very involved in the effort. I was a spontaneous volunteer first responder, and helped out with the effort for those 2 weeks, and then for the next year and a half. And I carried certain wounds, maybe some unexpected pain or wounds. I would say they probably weren't unexpected, but this was one that really threw me for a loop. And it only finally came up 17 years after the event, so 2018, that the pain that I was carrying, it's funny because I'm going to call it pain because it felt more like pain, but it was also the confusion. It was also just the, what? Just because it was just so like, what? It was this pain and confusion of, wow, human beings do this to each other? Now, mind you, here I was in my 20s when 9/11 happened and when I was involved. And of course, up until my 20s, like of course I'd seen horrors before. I'd seen violence before. I'd seen human beings hurt each other in horrible ways for we've all seen this, right, on the news or perhaps in our own lives. This may have been one of the first times in my life where I really saw it right in front of me in such stark form. But the pain that came up 17 years after the event itself was this awful, like, wait, humans do this to each other? And so it was this like pain, the confusion pain of like, what? This is crazy. And again, it's so funny because I say this and I'm like, well, of course it was crazy. The other people were probably looking at me and go, well, of course it was crazy. Emily, why did it take you 17 years? It's not that I didn't see how horrible it was at the time, but it was more from this like primal place as a human being. Like, wow. Because I think up until then, as I think a lot of us are, we become kind of inured or like, well, it's just the way things, not that's the way things are, but just like you see it so much that to self-protect, you just kind of go, okay, that exists. But what I realized was that having been immersed in the horrors, the horrific results of that day, that's actually was one of the deepest core wounds of confusion and just bafflement that I carried from 9/11. I'll give you another example of like a humanity confusion pain. There are so many people I know, and a lot of times they'd be people who would probably call themselves light workers, or maybe they have some kind of intuitive abilities or psychic or what have you, or they're energy healers or whatever. It's usually very energetically sensitive people that I know, typically tends to be. But, when I've worked with them, in terms of my work and done my work with them or just had conversations, frequently I'll hear that when they were kids, and sometimes we draw these out as well, that when they were kids, they had this moment of seeing this world that they've been born into and being like, what? Like, this is crazy. What am I doing here? And for a lot of them, it actually resulted in a kind of sometimes rejection of the world, being like, this is insane. And I reject it completely because of the trauma of like seeing this planet, the state that it's in and the way people treat each other. But there's also that pain of that confusion of like, what? Because it's so contrary. And this is more on like the humanity level is what I'm talking. It's just so contrary to what they and we instinctively know is right. As children, and all of our innocence and all of our purity and all of our intuitive knowing about what's right or wrong. And I understand sometimes children need to learn, but a lot of times we have that inborn with us. We know when something's wrong. We know when something's right. There can be that just complete, utter bafflement when it comes to humanity as a whole. So it can be with family, it can be with community society, but it can also be with humanity as a whole because of the greater problems. And so anyway, this is just an introduction to this topic, but I hope this has been helpful to help you recognize that if you've got some kind of whatever struggles you have, and especially when it comes to the inner child, is that you may also have those inner children inside of you that are carrying that confusion. And especially, I'm just going to offer this, especially when it comes to if you have trouble reconciling, that was the word I was looking for earlier, if you're having trouble reconciling the fact that, let's say, someone is your mother or your father, and the fact that they're treating you in a way it's not caring, it's not motherly or fatherly, that's not kindly parental or healthy, that and you have struggle with how do you feel about this person, I would just offer, I would recommend that as part of your own journey that you look into the part or parts of you, especially I would think it's the inner child or children, the inner children inside you that are carrying this confusion. And what I would offer is to honor the confusion of that child And this is what I often do when I'm working with a confused inner child, is I just honor it. I validate it. Yeah, God, that must have been so hard and so confusing. You're right. It doesn't make sense. You see, talking to a child, validating, you're right, it doesn't make any sense. It's not, and I also validate its feelings. No, it's not okay that it hurt you in this way. It's not okay for someone to treat you that way. So it's validating, it's honoring, it's helping that child feel less alone in its confusion. Because of course, if the child, if you grew up in an environment where this was the norm and yet nobody was reflecting that back to you to say, this is not okay, or no one was protecting you or defending you, then there's really that sense of isolation and that confusion. And so I would just offer that as part of your work on yourself and your journey with your own inner children and your journey to heal the wounds of childhood, take a moment to notice if or that there are those children of confusion that have that confusion pain, and take the time necessary to draw them out and really listen to them and honor that their confusion is a form of pain, that it's not about trying to fix or reconcile it for them, and it's not about trying to like answer. I mean, maybe there's some questions that could be answered, but just to honor and validate that there is that confusion and that there's pain from that confusion. So I hope this has been helpful. As always, again, my name is Emily Eldridge. I'm with changelight.world. As always, check us out. In fact, we've got some new programs we're launching for children. I'm really excited about that, doing a pilot program. And I'm going to be launching stuff for inmates as well. So I didn't even think about this. This is quite timely, isn't it, for me to be doing this show? So check us out, changelight.world, and I will talk to you again soon. Mwah! Love you.